Greetings, YouTubers. I wanted to talk a little bit about the idea of the BRICS Union of Nations, block of nations, I should say, and the idea of a gold-backed currency and what's wrong with it. There's been a lot of sort of talk, hoopla, hype about amongst like gold bugs and things like that about the BRICS nations, which is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And there's a bunch of new countries that are going to be joining them, mostly a lot of oil producers like Saudi Arabia and such. And there's been a lot of excitement among gold bugs over this idea that these countries are going to get together and they're going to try to get away from the US dollar system. And the end result of this is that gold bugs hope that the price of gold will go up and all the gold they've been hoarding will be worth a lot more. I am a gold bug myself. I think gold is going to go up. I think inflation is going to stay high, and I think gold will continue to be a good investment. I think investing in gold miners is a good way to play that. But there's a lot of problems with a lot of these ideas. Gold bugs tend to jump on a lot of conspiracy bandwagons and things like that. And the problem with this is it can cause them to make a lot of dumb decisions with their money that ends up losing them money rather than making money, which is obviously what they're trying to do. So I think it's important to check your biases and not ignore evidence that doesn't fit what you want, the way you want the world to be. Otherwise, you're just going to end up hurting yourself. So about the BRICS, there was about a year ago, I think it was, started to be a lot of hype, or actually probably not a number of years back, started to be a lot of hype about this idea that the BRICS nations were going to get together and they were all going to stop using the dollar for trade between themselves and start using, or they were going to invent a new currency, come up with a new currency that was going to be gold-backed. It was going to be back to the gold standard. They're going to have a gold-backed something or other. Now, this idea there's almost no chance of this happening, and it should be really obvious if you just stop and think about it. It's very hard to be on a gold standard. A country has to be very fiscally disciplined, and they can't be printing a lot of money, because for every unit of currency that they print, they have to have gold to back it up, right? So they can't just be profligate with their spending and their printing and such. Now, as much as we like to, and by we I mean gold bugs, or just people in general who like to criticize the government, as much as we like to talk about, fiat currency, or we talk about the dollar being, they went off the gold standard and in 1971, and so now it's just fiat money. And this is all terrible, and inflation's gonna destroy the value of the currency over time, and that's 100% true. But as much as that's true for the dollar, it's even worse for most of these other countries. The thing about the U.S. going off the dollar standard, off the gold standard in 1971, is that when the United States went off the gold standard in 1971, they were practically the last ones on the gold standard. Everybody else already went off it. And that's why the United States that's why the US dollar became the world's reserve currency. Because everybody else went off the gold standard. They were all bankrupt after World War I. And the United States was still on the gold standard. So everybody wanted to buy dollars because they wanted their money to be as good as gold. They didn't want to lose all their wealth and purchasing power They didn't want to lose it to inflation in their own currency, so they put it into US dollars, which were backed by gold. And so what happened then in 1971, or let's say what happened before that. So these other countries, after World War I, they wanted to have US dollars, and then in World War II especially, they wanted US dollars, and the US was still a gold-backed currency. We were still on the gold standard, and they had all gone off it. And so the U.S. had all the gold, pretty much. A huge percentage of the world's gold was in the U.S. And all these other countries were holding dollars, and the dollar became the reserve currency. But then came the 50s and the 60s. Especially in the 60s, the U.S. started printing a lot more dollars to pay for all these programs. So we had to pay for the Vietnam War, and all this spending, and then we had to pay for the welfare state, which started under LBJ, all the Great Society programs. So all this guns and butter, as they call it, and other countries that held all these dollars started realizing, well, you know what, the U.S. is printing way too much money, and we don't think they really have the gold to back this money. So they started bringing all their dollars back to the U.S. and saying, hey, here's your dollars, give us the gold. And this got bad, worse and worse, so they were taking all the gold out. And so finally in 1971, Nixon just decided, he just came out and made an announcement that the United States was temporarily suspending the convertibility of the dollar into gold. I think a few months later, another announcement was made that this temporary change was permanent, and that was it. We were off the gold standard. So when you hear Democrats and Republicans arguing when they're trying to raise the debt ceiling, and you hear them arguing over, we have to raise the debt ceiling because we can't default on our debts. The United States never defaults on our debts. That's a lie. And you can tell Democrats or Republicans, tell them both, because they're both full of it. That's a lie. We've defaulted on our debts many times, and one of the times that we defaulted on our debts was in 1971 when we defaulted on the promise to pay gold for dollars. We told everybody out there in the world that had dollars in 1971, we told them, we default, your dollars are just paper now. You can't get gold for them anymore. So don't believe any of that malarkey that we told you. But again, we go back to this idea that as bad as that was, the other countries were worse because they already defaulted. All of them defaulted. They were all off the gold standard by that time. So because the US dollar was already the reserve currency, it just remained the reserve currency, and this system continued on because we had the strongest military. We had this very large economy, and also because we were willing to run a lot of deficits. We were printing a lot of money and spending this money all over the world. So there's a lot of dollars all around the world, and countries could trade in dollars. They knew if they had surpluses in other countries, they could convert them into dollars really easily, and then bring that back to their country, and they could use those dollars to buy the things that they need: oil, commodities, whatever, weapons. So this brings us to the problem with the BRICS. Now, they're never going to have a BRICS gold-backed currency, because if it got to the point where the United States couldn't even be fiscally disciplined enough to not to print so much money, so that they had to go off the gold standard, because we couldn't back our dollars with gold anymore because we're printing too many of them. None of these other countries, you think Russia, China, India, countries like this, you think they're going to have a currency that's gold-backed and they're really going to be that fiscally disciplined? No way. They all want to print money, and they all want to inflate, and they all want to play these games. So there's never going to be a BRICS gold-backed currency. This is a total pipe dream. This is propaganda. Even Russia and some of the other countries, or India and some of the other countries that are part of the BRICS pact, or whatever you call it, community, they've even come out during the last year and were basically throwing water on this whole idea. They were saying, no, basically, there's not really any serious talk about creating a new currency. What we want to really talk about is bilateral trade in our own currency. So we want to talk about, Russia and China trading in rubles and Chinese yuan, or so-called renminbi, rather than using dollars or euros, right? So that's what they want to talk about. They want to talk about using the currencies, their own currencies, their national currencies that they already have. So set aside the idea of a gold-backed currency. The idea that has been popular among many, which is an idea that makes sense to me and has been talked about by people like Zoltan Pozsar, I think, and another favorite of mine, Luke Gromen, talks about it all the time. But the reason I wanted to make this video is Luke's been talking about this idea for years. Let me first say what the idea is. So, the idea is that the countries in the BRICS Pact, and any country really, that just doesn't want to be beholden to the US dollar and doesn't want to be keeping their country's national reserves in dollars because they don't want to be subject to sanctions like what's happened with Russia and Iran and so many other countries, is they've been talking about this idea that they could trade in their own currencies and then settle the difference in a neutral reserve asset, and that asset could be gold, right? So if Russia has oil that they want to trade, and China has manufactured goods, like let's say electronics and stuff that they want to trade, Russia could sell X amount of oil to China, and China could sell X amount of manufactured goods to Russia. And if there's a balance, if either of them has a balance left over after they bought whatever they want, they could settle that in gold. So if let's say there's a $500 million or whatever is left over after they do their trade, then whichever party has money coming to them, so that Russia didn't have to keep yuan and China didn't have to keep rubles, they could take that amount and settle it in gold. They could just buy gold that was in that country, and they could repatriate that gold back to their country, and then they're not subject to sanctions, right? Because the money, the gold is in vaults in their own country, so there's no way to sanction them. Now, this idea is one that, like I say, Zoltan Pozsar, Luke Gromen, and many, many others have talked about this idea for a long time, and it makes sense. But the reason I wanted to make this video is I was just listening to Luke Gromen's latest Q&A video, and this thing came up again, and it immediately made me think of a news story that I read today, and it points out a real big problem with this scenario, and that is that the sheer amount of wealth that's being traded between these countries and the amount of surpluses that they are building up in the process of this trading is so large that it oftentimes is not really feasible to settle it in gold. And the perfect example is that today I was reading this story in Reuters and Bloomberg and several places about how since the sanctions have started and Russia started trading a lot of oil to India, selling a lot of oil to India for Indian rupees, right? They can't take dollars anymore because they're cut out of the dollar system. They're under these sanctions, and they can't trade dollars a lot of in many cases. And they don't want to have dollars. They don't want to have treasuries and so forth. They want them in other things that they can deal with and that they can't be sanctioned with. So the problem is that since these sanctions started, the Russians have built up a trade surplus. They now have $39 billion worth of Indian rupees stuck in India in Indian banks, and they don't have any way to get them out. Really, they don't have any way to get them out because they don't have any use for Indian rupees in their country. And so we say, why can't they settle this in gold? Now, here's why. And here's the problem with having gold as a neutral settlement currency for these huge trade surpluses. 1 ton of gold at today's prices, say about $2,000 an ounce, is approximately $60 million. And for $39 billion, you would have to come up with approximately 650 tons of gold. Now, I was just checking, and I don't know if it's the latest figure, but one figure that came up when I did a quick and dirty Google search was that India, in its central bank, had 700 something tons of gold. Now, let's just say maybe that was an outdated figure. Let's say they have 1,000 tons of gold. To settle this trade deficit with one country, Russia, would wipe out like more than 50% of their entire central bank reserves of gold. So it's not really feasible, right? It's not, countries don't have that much. If a central bank in a country adds in a month, 5 or 10 tons of gold, that's like a major announcement. They'll announce, I think the Czech Republic last month added like 2 tons of gold. Well, imagine if you had to settle this deficit, 650 tons of gold, not to mention the amount of, the expense, the logistics involved in transporting 650 tons of gold. But even just the fact that, most countries don't have that. So this is the problem. I mean, gold would have to go up. Gold, let's put it this way. Gold at its current price is not really, the gold market is not large enough really to settle these kind of massive trade imbalances. Gold would have to go up in value quite a lot. Like, let's say gold went up 10 times in price from its current value. So let's say it was $20,000 an ounce. It would, then Russia could settle that trade. They could take 65 tons of gold from India, which would be still a lot of gold, but it would be at least a feasible, a reasonable, doable amount. But again, here's the problem. So we say, okay, well, gold can go up. But if gold goes up 10 times through just general inflation, well, that means pretty much everything else will go up 10 times as well. So oil will go up 10 times. So then the deficit will be 10 times larger, and then you're right back to square one. You need 650 tons to settle this trade imbalance. So it's a conundrum. It's not really, part of the problem is there's probably not a lot of Indian goods, or not enough Indian goods that Russia needs. I mean, after they take however much, chicken makhni and curry dinners that they want to buy from, I'm being facetious, I don't know, what does India sell? What are products that come out of India? I mean, tech support and spices and food and stuff. I'm sure there's a lot of things that I'm not thinking of. But anyways, whatever it is, it's not enough, because they're winding up with this huge trade surplus. And again, as the news stories brought out, it's stuck in India, in Indian banks denominated in Indian rupees, and it's a problem for them because they're not part of the dollar system, and there's not really anything else that they can easily put this into in order to get the wealth, say, back to their repatriated and back into their sphere of control. So anyways, that's all I wanted to talk about, just some food for thought today. And I don't really know what the answer is. I mean, maybe there's something I'm not thinking about. If you guys, anybody has any comments and you want to add it in the comment section about how they can solve this, maybe there's some ideas out there that I haven't heard about. Feel free to leave your comments, and I'll see you again next time. Thanks.